The weaver. Now the tunic was without seam, woven from the top in one piece. John 19:23. The upright loom was the most common in Second Temple times. This reconstructed loom is hung with clay loom weights found at Masada, a fragment of cloth among many discovered at Masada. There are many references in ancient Jewish texts to the preparation of cloth, from the sowing of the flaxseed, the combing of flax, to spinning and weaving. That spinning was done outdoors is understood from a Talmudic reference to gossips who spin their yarn by moonlight, Sota 6a, and the sinner who spins in the street, Ketuboth 7b. Linen was sometimes imported from Egypt, although local production was also known, with linen coming mainly from Galilee and wool from Judea. The most common loom mentioned is a standing loom with the warp stretched between an upper and a lower beam, or with loom weights stretching the warp. A treadle loom is mentioned in the Talmud, Shabbat 105a, as being worked by men. All of the family's clothes and blankets were woven in the home, using a standard loom, with weaving begun at the top of the garment. Clothing. And from him who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Luke 6:29. Various forms of dress had great symbolism in the Roman world. A toga of natural, undyed wool was a sign of citizenship. A toga with a purple band was worn by a magistrate, while a dark wool toga indicated mourning and whitened wool a politician. Among farmers, a short tunic was the norm for work. Two pieces of clothing were usually worn by both men and women, a poncho-style undergarment and a mantle draped over it, usually removed when indoors. The undergarment was sometimes made of linen, although numerous references to linen and purple, Luke 16:19, Revelation 18:16, inter alia, show that pure linen garments were a rich person's prerogative. Women also wore a headdress when they went out in public. Jewish males of the time of Jesus did not always wear a head covering. The mantle was made of one piece of cloth, John 19:23. To the mantle, the ritual fringes required by the Bible, Numbers 15:37-41 and Deuteronomy 22:12, were fixed. Ancient commentaries tell us that the length of these fringes was not standard at the time of Jesus, as does Jesus' criticism of the Pharisees who enlarged the borders on their garments, Matthew 23:5, to show piety. The mantle could be worn in a number of ways, thrown over the back of the neck and fastened with a brooch or over one shoulder. The most costly form of purple dye was manufactured from the secretion of the Murex trunculus sea snail. Purple signified royalty. The Roman expression parallel to the modern blue blood was purple blood. Recent research shows that this pure purple dye, Tyrian purple, biblical argomon, when exposed to sunlight, becomes the sky blue techelet, one thread of which was required as part of the ritual fringes. Lydia, Acts 16:14, was a dealer in purple, and therefore likely to have been a wealthy and influential woman. For those who could not afford the real thing, imitation purple was derived from the hyacinth flower and other sources. The grain mill. Give us this day our daily bread. Luke 11:3. Putting one's nose to the grinding stone was more than just an expression at the time of Jesus. Grinding of wheat and corn was done daily, just enough to bake that day's bread, giving new significance to the famous words from the Lord's Prayer. About 10 pounds of flour could be produced in 1 hour's grinding on the large 2-part hourglass-shaped grinder. Grinders were often constructed of basalt, a hard rock that would stand up to the wear and tear. The conical lower half of the mill was topped by a pivoting hourglass-shaped stone. Grain was poured into the top, ran down through a small opening between the top and bottom stone, and then into a trough, often incised into the base of the lower stone. A donkey's entire life could be spent turning the grinding stone, but unhappy was the horse that thus may have finished an illustrious career when too old or weak for other tasks. Smaller round grinding stones were meant to be operated by hand while seated, and could produce about 2 pounds of flour per hour. The grinding of each day's grain into flour was the task of the woman of the household. Games. Children played quoits or ball games. Games of dice were played by adults with pieces made of glass, ivory, or metal. One popular game was played on a game board divided into 24 parts by 12 parallel lines and one transverse line. Ball games were played, sometimes in teams, with balls filled with air or stuffed with feathers. A kind of volleyball was played where a ball was thrown up into the air and players standing nearby tried to catch it. Game boards were often carved into a street's paving stones, such as this one in Sepphoris in the Galilee. Designs etched on the late Roman era paving stones known as the lithostratos beneath Jerusalem's Sisters of Zion Covenant are believed to have been used in a dice game called the Game of the King. Ancient dice made of stone. A typical synagogue of Jesus' day. The size and appointments of the synagogue depended on the means of the villagers or townspeople it served, who took it upon themselves to build and maintain this most important of community institutions. The synagogue. And when he had come to his own country, he taught them in their synagogue. Matthew 13:54. True to the Greek translation of its name, the synagogue at the time of Jesus was first and foremost a place of assembly. The few first-century synagogues so far unearthed by archaeologists are simple structures with almost none of the elements that would characterize them in later times, such as mosaic floors or inscriptions. Still, they were usually the largest building in the village, and with their clerestories or gabled, tiled roofs, stood out from the flat clay roofs surrounding them. The Thanksgiving scroll from Qumran, similar in appearance to Bible scrolls read in synagogue in the days of Jesus. Though prayer in the synagogues was not unknown, Matthew 6:5, the main religious activity that took place in the synagogue was the reading of a Torah portion on the Sabbath and holidays, its translation into Aramaic or Greek, and a reading from the prophets as Luke describes, Luke 4:16-17. As a sign of respect for the Holy Scriptures, Jesus would probably have stood to read the Torah, possibly on a wooden dais in the center of the room. But unlike modern-day teachers and preachers who stand to deliver their message, in order to address the congregation, he would have taken the seat reserved for the teacher known as the Moses seat, Matthew 23:2. In the days of Jesus, a particular order of reading the Torah or the prophets had not yet come into being, so Jesus may have chosen the passage himself on that Sabbath day in Nazareth. The discussion which Luke records in the wake of Jesus' reading from Isaiah, Luke 4:16-28, would have been typical of the synagogue atmosphere in those days before prayer was a regular and central part of synagogue routine. Not silent reverence, but dialogue and discussion, and probably a great deal of milling around before or after the readings and teachings, or even during them, took place. People could seat themselves on the stone or wooden benches that lined the synagogue walls or on mats on the floor. Such a day it must have been when in one of the synagogues Jesus healed a crippled woman on the Sabbath day, Luke 13:11-17. The event was denounced by the synagogue ruler, but in the end Jesus seems to have won that particular very public debate. The synagogue at Masada, used in the first century by the Sicarii inhabitants of the palace fortress. Remains of the first century synagogue at Gamla in the Golan Heights. This vignette also highlights the presence of women in the synagogue without reference to any kind of separation based on gender. Speaking in Thessalonica over 3 Sabbaths to a congregation that also included women, Paul converted many of them. Acts 17:4. Early writings note that women could be called to read from the Torah as long as a man had read first, and only in the latter writings of the Babylonian Talmud women were barred from reading the Torah in public. Jewish sources trace the idea of the synagogue to the early days after the destruction of the first temple and the words of Ezekiel 11:16. Therefore say, Thus says the Lord God, although I have cast them far off among the Gentiles, and although I have scattered them among the countries, yet I shall be a little sanctuary for them in the countries where they have gone. This interpretation allowed the synagogue, the little sanctuary, to evolve from a place of gathering, adding elements both liturgical and architectural that would eventually allow the synagogue to evolve into the house of prayer that it is today. Education. An inkpot. Having then gifts differing according to the grace that is given to us, let us use them, he who teaches, in teaching. Romans 12:6-7. Shard inscribed with the alphabet. Perhaps a scribal exercise. Schooling was among the most binding obligations of a father to his son, and originally the father was his child's teacher. Later, according to the Jerusalem Talmud, schools were established by King Alexander Jannaeus in the 1st century BCE to educate fatherless boys. The purpose of education was not to impart social status or a trade, the teaching of a trade being the task of the father, but rather to teach the Torah with an eye to inculcating correct moral behavior. Children learned to read Torah beginning at 5 years of age. At 10, they began the study of the oral law, commentaries of the sages on various biblical passages. Because these were the days before the invention of vowels in Hebrew, students had to listen intently to their teachers to catch the correct pronunciation of every word. School was often held in the main room of the synagogue with wooden benches that could be removed when class was not in session. Classes began early in the morning, continued until a break in the afternoon, and then resumed in the evening. Studies were conducted every day of the week, including the Sabbath eve and Sabbath itself. The maximum number of students in a class was ideally 25, above which the teacher was entitled to an assistant. Girls did not usually attend school, although it is assumed that because their future role in educating their own children was great, they did receive an education at home at the hands of their father or mother. Ideally, the teacher, like other public servants, was not to take money for his services. In a commentary on Deuteronomy 4:5, surely I have taught you statutes and judgments. The Nedarim tractate of the Jerusalem Talmud states, what I have given freely you must give freely. But payment to teachers is mentioned in many cases. Parents would pay the teachers individually, and tuition for poor children was covered by public funds. Writing implements, like those pictured here, wax tablets that could be reused, were rare. Much ancient education depended on listening to the teacher. Significantly, Jesus repeats the words, "You have heard it said," Matthew 5:21, several times in his teachings in the Sermon on the Mount. The Babylonian Talmud, Gittin 36a, tells of one teacher who lost his position because he used to beat his students, but who was later reinstated after no substitute could be found to replicate his impeccable pronunciation.